It was exactly 1 week before Christmas in 2015. The streaming giant Netflix had just released one of the most sensational and infamous true crime documentaries of all time, Making a Murderer. Making a Murderer, Season 1 follows the case of Stephen Avery, a Wisconsin man who was exonerated after spending 18 years in prison for a sexual assault he didn't commit, only to be arrested and convicted for the murder of photographer Teresa Halbach just 2 years after his release. The 10-episode documentary meticulously examines the investigation and trials of both Avery and his nephew, Brendan Dassey, raising serious questions about police conduct, potential evidence tampering, and the interrogation tactics used to obtain Dassey's confession. The series chronicles the defense team's arguments that Avery was framed by the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department in retaliation for his $36 million civil lawsuit against them for his wrongful conviction. Through extensive courtroom footage, interviews with the defense and Avery's family, and analysis of key evidence, the documentary presents a disturbing portrait of potential systemic corruption in the criminal justice system, while exploring how socioeconomic status and cognitive disabilities can make individuals particularly vulnerable to wrongful conviction. Making a Murderer Season 2 delves deeply into Brendan Dassey's case, highlighting how his controversial confession became a critical component in convicting both himself and his uncle, Stephen Avery. The series follows Dassey's post-conviction legal team, led by Laura Nyrider and Stephen Dreisen from the Center on Wrongful Convictions, as they argue that investigators used psychologically coercive techniques to extract a false confession from a vulnerable teenager with cognitive limitations. Their appeals focus on demonstrating how detectives fed Dassey specific information and pressured him until he produced the narrative they wanted, despite numerous inconsistencies in his statements. The documentary meticulously examines how the state leveraged Dassey's confession to build its case against Avery, even though no physical evidence corroborated Dassey's statements about a brutal assault in Avery's bedroom. Through courtroom footage and interviews with legal experts, the series traces Dassey's legal journey through multiple courts, including a momentous yet ultimately reversed federal court victory, revealing how the justice system remains resistant to reconsidering juvenile confessions even when obtained through questionable methods. Meanwhile, footage of Dassey's phone calls from prison exposes the profound human cost as he struggles to understand the complex legal proceedings that will determine his fate. And while it's quite easy to get hung up on these kinds of cases in America, similar blatant and frankly evil miscarriages of justice occur elsewhere. Because the fact is, New Zealand has its own Brendan Dassey. Today we're diving into one of New Zealand's most notorious miscarriages of justice, the case of Teina Pora, a 17-year-old boy with the mental capacity of a child who would confess to a murder he didn't commit. What if I told you this same young man would spend the next 2 decades of his life behind bars, while the real killer remained free? And the most heartbreaking is that all of this happened because the police missed what was right in front of them the entire time. March 23, 1992, Auckland, New Zealand. 39-year-old Susan Burdett returns home after a night of bowling, where she'd scored her personal best. An accounts clerk who lived alone, Burdett was known to be cautious about her safety. She kept a baseball bat by her bed for protection. The next day, when Burdett failed to show up for work, concerned colleagues raised the alarm. Her friend Stephen Dawson went to her home to check on her. What he discovered was horrific. Susan Burdett lay dead on her bed. She had been brutally raped and bludgeoned to death with her own baseball bat. The scene was methodical, her upper body covered with a blood-soaked duvet, her legs crossed and hanging off the side of the bed. For a year, the case went cold. Police had collected semen samples from the scene but had no match in their database. They were desperate for a break. Enter Teina Pora. Born in 1975, Pora grew up in Otara, one of Auckland's poorest neighborhoods. His childhood was marked by tragedy. His teenage mother died of cancer when he was just 4 years old. After her death, Pora bounced between relatives, spent time in boys' homes, and eventually became tangled up in a dispute with the mongrel mob gang over a stolen vehicle. But there was something else about Teina Pora that police didn't know at the time. Something crucial that would have changed everything. Pora was born with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder caused by his mother's drinking during pregnancy. At 17, he had the mental age of a 9 or 10-year-old child. In March 1993, Pora was arrested on unrelated charges. While in custody, he learned there was a $20,000 reward for information about Burdett's murder. To a teenager from poverty with cognitive impairments, this was an astronomical sum, and considering that Teina had a newborn daughter, he could really use the money. Seeking the reward, Pora told police he was present when the murder happened, that he was the driver that took members of the mongrel mob gang to Susan's house. What followed was a 14-hour interrogation without a lawyer present. During this marathon questioning, Pora's story changed repeatedly as he tried to give the officers what they wanted to hear. But there were just a few issues. Teina couldn't accurately describe Susan. He said she was fair-haired and overweight. She had dark hair and was slim. At one point, the detectives took Teina to her house because he couldn't actually tell them where she lived, and he had no idea which residence was Susan's. Carefully watch the following excerpts from his interrogation. You'll see crucial details are fed to him. Keep in mind, the police had him in custody for 96 hours and only videotaped approximately 14 hours of it. Any reasonable person would ask if conversations occurred with Pora that were not documented.
Sit down, mate. Okay, it's got a few preliminary things we've got to do, Teina, okay? So just go through those first and we'll introduce everybody in the room. Okay? Perhaps you could tell us your full name and address, Teina.
Name is Teina Anthony Pora.
How old are you?
17.
Okay, well, just to establish why we're here, and why we're in fact talking here today, Teina, it's because I spoke to you earlier about an unrelated matter, and you brought to my attention the fact that you had some information relating to the Burdett homicide. Is that correct?
Yes.
That's why we're here today. That's why Mr. Rutherford, yourself and I are here in the room, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Is that correct?
Yes.
You're quite happy to talk about it?
Yes.
And it was you, in fact, who brought the matter up?
Yes.
Where did you go from there?
The Superstruck.
Superstruck. What did you do?
Walked in, grabbed me some 20 cents, and that's when Dog and Hound came up to me.
Dog and Hound came up to you? What, when you were cashing in the money?
To go and play some spaces.
And what did they say to you?
Come on, let's go. Take me and follow that lady there. Yeah, I said to him, what are you gonna do about it? And he said, wait till she leaves and we'll follow her home. Took her wallet.
You took her wallet, okay.
And I grabbed the camera.
Over the course of the 4 days, his account came to include more and more of the things that the police knew, but Teina didn't know from the public domain.
Put the stuff in here, okay? Just have a bit of a break and we're going to carry on. Right, Teina,
I just asked you whether or not there's anything else that you haven't included in the interview, right? And you've just told me something, right?
About me?
Yeah. Just speak up so we can all hear. Just tell us again what you said.
I helped him hold it down.
You helped who hold it down?
Me and Hound were holding it down.
Sorry?
Me and Hound were holding it down.
Me and Hound were holding it down.
My dog was getting into it.
My dog was getting into her. Okay. How was she lying? A picture here, which is basically a square. I say it's a bed. Alright, happy with that? That's a bed, right? Are you sure she was in that position?
After he was raping it.
Was she on top of the bed, under the bedclothes, Anything over her head or face or anything like that? Hmm? You don't know. When you last saw her, just think about this for a moment, alright? When you last saw her, what position was she in? How was she in the bed? And you say you got a good look at this woman, is that right? Is this correct?
Yeah.
Okay. What'd she look like?
So fair looking. White.
Sorry?
So fair.
Fair.
White.
White? What do you mean white?
My skin.
White skin. Alright. Anything else about her? And you got a good look at this woman, didn't you?
Yeah.
Alright. Anything else?
Fat looking.
Alright, I'm going to then sort of get to a house or where she lives.
I think it was up by the top of the hill.
You've got to remember, a year ago, physical appearances of properties and things can change, alright? By that I mean things can grow, things can be cut, pulled out, things like that. Look on both sides of the road, have a look. Anything around here that looks familiar? Let's wander over here. See, the lady went into a driveway. Is that right? Three driveways around here, corner of Pora and Olive Road. Have a look up there and down here. Anything you see William? No? It was dark, alright. Well look, it's obvious you just don't know exactly which house. Would you agree with that? Would you agree with that? Or, okay. If I show you a house, do you think that would help you? Alright. Well, this is the house here I'm showing you at 105 Pora Road. With this hedge here. Alright? Does that mean anything to you? What does it mean to you? It's the house you came to.
If you've committed a fairly heinous crime, you shouldn't have any difficulty identifying the house where you've done that, particularly if it's only a year earlier. It would have to rank as one of the most significant experiences in your life, I would think, particularly as a 17-year-old. Certainly at that point, when he was unable to identify the house, that would have been an appropriate time for a pretty strong challenge.
Notice how Teina had no idea about specific details of the crime, how she was positioned, the manner of death, nothing. Despite the inconsistencies in his confession, despite no physical evidence linking him to the crime, and despite the fact that investigators had no idea of his cognitive disabilities, police charged Teina Pora with the rape and murder of Susan Burdett. In 1994, at just 19 years old, Teina Pora was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. But here's where the story takes an even more disturbing turn. In 1996, 2 years after Pora's conviction, DNA testing identified the semen found in Susan Burdett's body. It belonged to Malcolm Rewa, a serial rapist who had terrorized Auckland throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. Rewa had a very specific method of attacking women. He would break into their homes, often through windows, surprise them as they prepared for bed, blindfold them, cover their upper bodies, and position their legs hanging off the bed during his assaults. Sound familiar? This was exactly how Susan Burdett was found. And just a little investigation into other attacks to look for patterns may have pointed them directly at the real perpetrator. But instead of recognizing their mistake and releasing Teina, prosecutors doubled down. They created a new theory that Pora and Rewa had committed the crime together. Despite the fact that Rewa always acted alone in his other attacks, and despite Pora never once mentioning Rewa in his confused confessions. In 1998, Malcolm Rewa was tried for Susan Burdett's rape and murder. The jury convicted him of rape but couldn't reach a verdict on the murder charge. A second trial ended the same way, and prosecutors stayed further proceedings against Rewa for the murder. Meanwhile, Teina Pora remained in prison. His legal team appealed his conviction based on the new DNA evidence linking Rewa to the crime. The Court of Appeal ordered a retrial, but in 2000, Pora was convicted a second time. It boils down to how incredibly hard it is for people who have never sat in an interrogation room to understand the massive psychological impact. For years, Teina Pora languished behind prison walls. But there were people who hadn't forgotten him. Police officers who had worked on the case began to express doubts. Detective Sergeant Dave Henwood, a criminal profiler, believed Rewa had acted alone in Burdett's murder, based on his knowledge of Rewa's criminal signature. In 2012, another senior officer wrote to the police commissioner expressing concern that the wrong man had been convicted. Even Susan Burdett's brother, Jim Burdett, believed Rewa was the sole perpetrator. He believed his sister had stood up for herself and that Rewa had taken her baseball bat and struck the blows that killed her. In 2013, the Police Association officially called for a review of Pora's conviction, citing sufficient concern among some senior detectives to warrant an inquiry. Enter Tim McKinnell, a former police officer turned private investigator. McKinnell became convinced of Pora's innocence and spent years fighting to have his case reopened. In 2014, after nearly 20 years behind bars, Teina Pora was finally released on parole. But his fight wasn't over. His legal team prepared an appeal to the Privy Council in London, New Zealand's final court of appeal at that time. They presented new evidence about Pora's fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and how it would have made him highly suggestible during police interrogation. On March 3, 2015, in what would be the last New Zealand case ever heard by the Privy Council, Teina Pora's convictions were quashed. The court decided not to order a retrial. After 21 years of fighting a system that had failed him at every turn, Teina Pora was finally a free man. In 2016, the New Zealand government awarded Teina Pora $2.5 million in compensation for his wrongful conviction and imprisonment. At the time, the largest compensation payment ever made by the New Zealand government. But Pora's legal team wasn't finished. They argued that the compensation, calculated at $100,000 per year of imprisonment based on 1998 guidelines, should be adjusted for inflation. In 2017, the High Court agreed, and Pora received an additional $1 million, bringing his total compensation to approximately $3.5 million. But while Teina Pora finally found justice, Susan Burdett's murder remained officially unsolved. That is until 2018, when prosecutors made a stunning decision. They would try Malcolm Rewa for Susan Burdett's murder a third time. In February 2019, nearly 27 years after Susan Burdett's murder, a jury unanimously found Malcolm Rewa guilty. The serial rapist who had attacked at least 25 women was finally convicted of the murder he had committed all those years ago. Justice Jeffrey Venning sentenced Rewa to life imprisonment, saying he remained a manipulative and controlling person who remains a danger to the community. Think about this for a moment. Teina Pora spent more than 20 years, his entire young adulthood, behind bars for a crime he did not commit. He went into prison as a teenager and came out a middle-aged man. His wrongful conviction wasn't just a fluke or an honest mistake. It was the result of a system that failed to protect a vulnerable young man with cognitive disabilities. It was the result of tunnel vision by investigators who couldn't see what was right in front of them. And it was the result of a criminal justice system that values confessions even when they make no sense. What happened to Teina Pora should never happen to anyone. And yet, similar cases continue to emerge around the world. So what can we learn from this case? First, vulnerable people need special protections during police interrogations. Pora was questioned for 14 hours without a lawyer and with no recognition of his cognitive disabilities. Detectives need to be trained to look for cognitive deficiencies and need to understand how that can dramatically affect a person during an interrogation. Second, DNA evidence should be given appropriate weight. The semen found at the crime scene belonged to Malcolm Rewa, not Teina Pora, yet prosecutors created an implausible theory to keep their conviction intact. Laws need to be passed that remove prosecutorial immunity when strong, reliable evidence is presented that the person originally charged or convicted was not involved. Third, when new evidence emerges, the system should be willing to correct its mistakes quickly, not force an innocent man to spend additional decades fighting for his freedom. The absolutely insane theories some prosecutors cook up simply to protect their conviction record is sickening. Teina Pora's case led to significant reforms in New Zealand's justice system. In 2020, the New Zealand government established the Criminal Cases Review Commission, an independent body tasked with investigating potential miscarriages of justice. But for Teina Pora, no reform can give back the years that were stolen from him. The potential he had was wasted, and while he can comfortably live the rest of his life, the emotional scars he carries to this day will hinder him. And now, the question that's been haunting this case from the beginning. How did Malcolm Rewa, a man who had raped at least 25 women, manage to avoid conviction for Susan Burdett's murder for so long? How did the system fixate on a confused teenager instead of the serial predator whose DNA was found at the scene? The disturbing truth is that Rewa was already on the police radar when Burdett was killed. He was suspected in a series of rapes, but hadn't yet been caught. Had investigators connected the dots sooner, perhaps Susan Burdett might still be alive today. And certainly, Teina Pora would not have lost 20 years of his life to prison. Today, Teina Pora lives a quiet life. With his compensation, he bought a home, provides for his daughter and grandson, and tries to rebuild the life that was taken from him. The money can never replace what he lost, but it offers him a chance at a future that was denied to him for so long. As for us, we're left with troubling questions about how our justice systems operate. How many other Teina Poras are out there, sitting in prison cells for crimes they didn't commit? How many Malcolm Rewas have escaped justice because investigators focused on the wrong person? These are questions we must continue to ask, because when the system fails one person, it fails us all. If you found this story as troubling as I did, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What aspects of this case disturbed you the most? What changes do you think need to be made to prevent similar injustices? Until next time, remember, justice delayed is justice denied, but it's never too late to make things right.